When something bothers you, you've probably seen it destroy enough lives that you feel compelled to say something. I'm sitting here in 2023, looking back over nearly a century of watching people handle money, and I see the same tragic mistake playing out over and over again. People think they're being careful. They think they're being prudent. They think they're being conservative by keeping their money in the bank. And I watch them year after year, decade after decade, slowly but surely becoming poorer while believing they're being safe. Let me tell you what I mean by that, because this is important. This might be one of the most important things I can tell you. Money sitting in a bank account is not wealth. Let me say that again. Money sitting in a bank account is not wealth. It is a claim on wealth. It is a medium of exchange. It is a measuring stick, but it is not wealth itself. And the distinction between those two things, that distinction will determine whether you end up comfortable or desperate when you're my age. I remember back in the 1940s when I was just starting out, my father kept a substantial amount of money in a savings account. He was a lawyer, a careful man, believed in being prudent with finances. He'd show me his bank book, and there was this pride in his voice when he'd point to the balance. "See, Charlie," he'd say, "this is our security. This is what keeps us safe." And I remember thinking even then something doesn't feel right about this. The number stays the same, but what that number can buy, that is changing, that is shrinking. But I was young, what did I know? So I kept quiet. Fast forward 10 years, and you know what happened. That money, the nominal amount stayed exactly the same. Every dollar was still there, but what it could actually purchase had dropped by maybe 30–40%. My father had watched the number thinking he was preserving wealth, but he was really just watching his purchasing power evaporate in slow motion. And the tragedy is, he never quite understood what happened. He'd kept his money safe, hadn't he? Every dollar was accounted for. How had he become poorer? But he had mathematically, inevitably, he had. And I see this same thing happening today, except it is worse now because at least back then savings accounts paid decent interest. Now you're earning what? 0.5% if you're lucky. Meanwhile, real inflation, and I'm not talking about what some government statistician tells you. I'm talking about the actual cost of things you need to buy, food, housing, healthcare, education. That is running 3, 4, maybe 5% a year. You do that math with me for a second. If inflation is running 4% and your savings account pays 0.5%, you're losing 3.5% of your purchasing power every single year. Every year that compounds against you. Let me show you what that means in practice, because people don't understand compound erosion the way they understand compound growth. Say you've got $100,000 in the bank today. You think you're being responsible, building a cash cushion, staying liquid, keeping it safe 10 years from now. That 100,000 is still 100,000 in nominal terms. But what it can actually buy, adjusted for what things really cost. You're down to maybe 70,000 in today's purchasing power. Another 10 years, you're down to 50,000. You haven't spent a dime, and you've lost half your wealth. That is the slow motion disaster nobody talks about because it doesn't make headlines. There is no dramatic crash. There is no scandal. Just this quiet, steady erosion that destroys more wealth than all the market crashes combined. And here is what really gets me. People do this because they're afraid of losing money. They're so scared of seeing their account balance go down that they accept absolute certainty that their purchasing power will decline. Does that make sense to you? You're afraid of a possible temporary loss, so you accept a guaranteed permanent loss. That is not rational thinking. That is fear overriding mathematics. I've been wealthy for a long time now, over 60 years. And you know what wealthy people understand that poor people don't. Cash is what you use for transactions, not for storing value. You keep enough cash to handle your immediate needs, pay your bills, deal with emergencies, maybe 3 to 6 months of expenses. But everything else needs to be working for you in productive assets. Because wealth isn't money. Wealth is ownership. Wealth is owning pieces of businesses that produce goods and services people need. Wealth is owning real estate that generates rent and appreciates as the currency depreciates. Wealth is owning assets that adapt to inflation automatically. Let me tell you about a friend of mine, and this is a true story, happened maybe 15 years ago. He'd sold his business, did very well, walked away with about $30 million. $30 million. And you know what he did? Put most of it in money market funds and certificates of deposit. His reasoning was he'd made his money. Now he just wanted to preserve it. He didn't want any risk. He'd sleep well knowing his principal was safe. I tried to talk to him about this. I said, "You're going to destroy yourself. The safe thing you're doing, it is the riskiest thing you could possibly do." But he wouldn't listen. He'd been through 2008, seen his portfolio drop 40%. Vowed never again. Cash felt safe. Cash felt smart. Well, 15 years later, where is he? His 30 million has grown to maybe 32 million with all that interest. Sounds okay, right? Except inflation over those 15 years has cut the purchasing power of each dollar by probably 40%. So his 32 million in nominal terms, he lost $11 million, 11 million. Not in a crash, not in a fraud, not in some dramatic failure, but by being careful, by being conservative, by doing exactly what the conventional wisdom told him to do. Meanwhile, Warren and I, we've been putting money into productive businesses for 60-some years now. Some years the market goes up, some years it goes down. We've been through 18 recessions, multiple market crashes, crisis after crisis. And you know what? The businesses adapt. They raise prices when costs increase. They find efficiencies. They grow earnings. They throw off cash. Over the long run, over the decades that actually matter, those businesses have compounded our wealth at 10, 12, 15% a year. While my friend was earning 0.5% and losing ground to inflation, we were compounding ahead of inflation by 10 percentage points annually. Over 15 years, that difference is enormous. That is the difference between security and anxiety in old age. So let me talk about what you should be doing instead, because I don't want to just tell you what is wrong. I want to tell you what is right. And let me be clear up front. I'm not telling you to go buy cryptocurrency or trade options or do anything speculative and stupid. That'll destroy you faster than inflation will. What I'm talking about is boring. It is simple. It is proven over a century of data. You need to own productive assets within your circle of competence. Let's start with the most obvious one, ownership in good businesses. Now, when I say businesses, I mean actual companies that make products or provide services people need. Companies with competitive advantages. Companies with reasonable debt levels. Companies with competent management. Companies you can understand. If you can't explain to a 10-year-old how the company makes money, you don't understand it well enough to own it. Stay away from things you don't understand. That is rule number 1, 2, and 3. Warren and I, we've made billions, literally billions of dollars, from just a handful of companies we understood deeply. We bought See's Candies back in 1972 for $25 million. People thought we overpaid. Everyone said we were crazy. It was a candy company, for goodness sake, not some high-tech growth story. But we understood it. We understood the business model. We understood the brand. We understood the economics. And you know what? That 25 million investment has returned to us over 50 years. Over $2 billion in cumulative earnings. 2 billion from 25 million. We didn't trade it. We didn't time the market. We just held ownership in a great business and let compounding do its work. And here is the beautiful thing about owning businesses through stocks. If you do it right, if you buy quality companies at fair prices, when inflation comes, these companies adapt. When their costs go up, they raise their prices. When I bought Coca-Cola stock in 1988, a Coke from a vending machine cost maybe 50 cents. Today it costs $2.50. Did that destroy Coca-Cola? Of course not. The business adjusted. Our ownership stake kept compounding in real terms, not just nominal terms. That is what a productive asset does. It responds to its environment. It evolves, it survives. Compare that to a dollar bill in a savings account. That dollar bill doesn't adapt. It doesn't respond. It doesn't evolve. It just sits there, becoming worth less and less as more dollars get printed into existence. You're holding a claim that is being deliberately debased, and you're calling it safety. That is not safety, that is delusion. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but Charlie, what about market crashes? What if I buy stocks and the market drops 40% tomorrow? Fair question. So let me answer it directly. Yes, stocks go down. Sometimes they go down a lot. I've lived through the crash of 1973-74 when the market dropped 50%. I lived through 2008 when it dropped similar amounts. It is painful to watch, I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But here is what you need to understand. If you hold good businesses, if you don't panic and sell at the bottom, those businesses have always recovered and gone on to new highs. Always, every single time in market history. The person who bought stocks in 1929, the worst possible timing right before the Great Depression, if they just held and never sold, they were back to break even in 15 years and enormously ahead in 25 years. The person who bought at the top in 2000 right before the tech crash, they were whole again in 7 years and way ahead in 15. Time heals everything if you own quality and have patience. But time doesn't heal cash. Cash held for 15 years is guaranteed to lose purchasing power. So which risk would you rather take? A temporary mark-to-market loss that history says will recover, or a permanent real loss that mathematics guarantees? To me, it is not even close. Let me talk about real estate for a minute, because that is another productive asset that makes sense for many people. And I'm not talking about flipping houses or speculating on condos in Miami. I'm talking about property that generates income, property that serves a real economic function, property where you understand the local market and can evaluate it properly within your circle of competence. I got into real estate development early in my career. Back in the 1960s, we'd buy apartment buildings in California, nothing fancy, just solid properties in decent locations that threw off rent every month. And here is what I learned. Real estate has this beautiful characteristic where your costs are largely fixed. If you finance it with a fixed-rate mortgage, but your income rises with inflation, your tenants are paying you rent that adjusts upward over time while your biggest expense, that mortgage payment, stays exactly the same. So inflation actually helps you. You're getting paid in dollars that are worth less while paying back debt in those same depreciated dollars. It is almost like free leverage. We bought one property, I remember this clearly. Bought it for about $300,000 in 1965. Fixed mortgage at maybe 5.5%. Over the next 30 years, rents tripled because of inflation. Our mortgage payment never changed by the time we paid that mortgage off. We owned an asset worth maybe $2.5 million that generated $150,000 a year in rent, all from a $40,000 down payment and the discipline to hold through multiple economic cycles. That $40,000 compounded into millions, not because we were brilliant, but because we owned a productive asset that adapted to inflation automatically. And this is important, real estate is work. It is not passive like owning stocks. You've got tenants, you've got maintenance, you've got regulations, you've got property taxes that keep going up. If you don't understand what you're getting into, if you don't have the temperament for being a landlord, if you can't evaluate properties properly, you can lose money. This is where circle of competence matters. Warren and I mostly stayed away from real estate in Berkshire because it is not our area of expertise. We stuck to businesses we understood. You need to be honest with yourself about what you actually understand versus what you think you understand. Now, there is another category I want to mention, though I'm somewhat conflicted about it, and that is precious metals, specifically gold. Warren and I have traditionally not been big gold enthusiasts, and I'll tell you why. Gold doesn't produce anything. It doesn't earn dividends. It doesn't create products. It doesn't generate cash flow. It just sits there glittering expensively. You're betting entirely on someone else paying you more for it later than you paid for it. That is speculation, not investment, and I'm saying this with some reluctance because I'm old enough to have seen my views evolve. There are times when gold makes sense as a small part of a portfolio. When governments are printing money recklessly, when inflation is running hot, when trust in institutions is breaking down. Gold has historically held its value. It has been money for 5,000 years, and there is probably a reason for that. So while I wouldn't put a large percentage in gold, having maybe 5 or 10% as catastrophe insurance, that is not crazy. Just understand what you're buying. You're not buying a productive asset. You're buying insurance against monetary chaos. Let me talk about government securities for a moment, treasury bonds and such. Now, these are interesting because they're backed by the government's ability to tax and print money. That makes them about as close to risk-free as exists, at least in nominal terms. The government will always pay you back in dollars. But here's the catch. They'll pay you back in dollars that may be worth substantially less than the dollars you lent them. So yes, you're safe from default risk, but you're not safe from inflation risk. That said, treasuries have a place. If you're older, if you need predictable income, if you're scared of volatility, having some of your money in short-term treasuries or treasury inflation-protected securities, those tips that adjust for inflation, that is not unreasonable. It is better than cash sitting in a bank earning nothing. At least you're getting some yield. And with tips, you're protecting against inflation explicitly. We hold some treasuries at Berkshire, not because they're great investments, but because we sometimes have more cash than we can immediately deploy into businesses we understand. And treasuries at least earn something while we wait for the right opportunity. But please understand, treasuries are not going to make you wealthy. They're a parking place, a holding pattern. The real wealth building happens through ownership of productive assets, businesses and real estate primarily. Treasuries are what you use for the portion of your money you absolutely cannot afford to lose in the short term. Everything else should be working harder. Now, here is something I want to emphasize because I think this is where people get confused. When I say don't keep cash in the bank, I'm not saying have zero liquidity. You need an emergency fund. Life happens, cars break down, people get sick, you lose your job. You need to be able to handle these things without being forced to sell your investments at the worst possible moment. So keep 3 to 6 months of living expenses in cash or near cash. That is your buffer, your insurance policy against life's inevitable surprises. But everything beyond that buffer, every dollar you're holding in excess of that emergency fund, that should be in productive assets. I've seen too many people make the opposite mistake. They'll keep 2 years of expenses in cash because it makes them feel secure. Meanwhile, that excess cash is losing 3 or 4% a year to inflation, compounding against them. Over 20 years, that is a devastating amount of wealth destruction, all in the name of feeling safe. Real safety comes from owning assets that compound ahead of inflation, not from watching a number that doesn't change while the world changes around it. Let me tell you something else that is important, and this relates to the banking system itself. Your bank is not your friend. I don't mean that in some conspiratorial way. I mean it is a business with its own interests that don't necessarily align with yours. The bank takes your deposits, pays you almost nothing, then lends that money out at much higher rates and pockets the difference. Meanwhile, you're taking on risks you probably don't fully understand. Bank deposits are only insured up to $250,000 per account by the FDIC. If you've got more than that in one institution and that bank fails, you're exposed now. Bank failures are rare in normal times, but they happen. I lived through the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and 90s. Hundreds of institutions failed. People lost money. And we might see something similar if economic conditions deteriorate, if commercial real estate crashes, if bad loans pile up. The banking system is more fragile than most people realize, especially when you look at how much leverage these institutions carry. Beyond that, banks can freeze your accounts, governments can impose capital controls, negative interest rates could force you to pay to keep your money deposited. These aren't hypothetical concerns. They've happened in various countries over the past decade. Your cash in the bank is not as accessible and safe as you think it is. You're an unsecured creditor to that institution. And if things go wrong, you might find that your money is suddenly not quite as available as you assumed. This is another reason to keep minimal cash in banks and maximum wealth in productive assets you actually own. When you own shares of Coca-Cola, you own a piece of that business directly. Berkshire owns it through Berkshire, but it is genuine ownership. The company can't confiscate that. The government would have to literally nationalize the company to take it from you, which has almost never happened in American history. But your bank account, much more vulnerable to various forms of interference. Now, let me address something that I know is on many people's minds, especially as we head toward 2024, 2025, maybe even 2026. What if we're headed for difficult economic times? What if inflation stays high? What if we get a recession? What if markets crash? Doesn't that mean you should hold cash and wait for better opportunities? I've heard this argument my entire career. The market's too high. Wait for a crash. There is too much uncertainty. Stay in cash. The economy's weakening. Be defensive. And you know what? The people who wait, they usually wait forever. Because there is always some reason to be scared. There is always some crisis on the horizon. There is always something that makes today seem like a bad time to invest. Meanwhile, the people who stay invested, who keep buying productive assets at reasonable prices regardless of what the headlines say, they compound their wealth year after year after year. Warren and I bought stocks in the 1950s when everyone said the market was overvalued. We bought in the 60s when Vietnam was raging. We bought in the 70s during stagflation and energy crises. We bought in the 80s when interest rates were at 15%, and everyone said stocks were dead. We bought after September 11th. We bought during the financial crisis in 2008 when people thought the world was ending. And you know what? Every single one of those times, in retrospect, turned out to be a good time to own businesses. Not because the problems went away, they didn't, but because good businesses adapt and survive and compound over time regardless of the macro environment. Could we have a recession in the next few years? Probably. We always do eventually. Could markets drop 20 or 30%? Sure, they do that periodically. Could inflation stay elevated longer than people expect? Absolutely. But none of that changes the fundamental logic. Cash loses to inflation with mathematical certainty. Productive assets have a chance to compound ahead of inflation if you choose wisely and hold patiently. I'll take the uncertain upside over the certain downside every single time. And here is something people don't think about enough. The best buying opportunities of your lifetime will come during the scariest times. When everyone is panicking, when the news is terrible, when it feels like the world is ending, that is when assets go on sale. But you can only take advantage if you're not panicking yourself. And the way you avoid panicking is by understanding what you own and why you own it. By having a long time horizon, by not being leveraged, and by having enough cash buffer that you're not forced to sell at the worst possible moment. Back in March 2009, in the depths of the financial crisis, Warren and I weren't worried about Berkshire surviving. We were looking for opportunities. We put $5 billion into Goldman Sachs, $3 billion into GE. Everyone thought we were catching falling knives, trying to be heroes, taking on excessive risk. But we understood those were fundamentally sound businesses being priced like they were going bankrupt. And you know what happened? We made excellent returns on those investments because we had the liquidity and the temperament to act when everyone else was frozen with fear. That only works if you're not sitting in cash because you're scared. It only works if you understand that volatility creates opportunity rather than danger. So let me try to bring this all together for you because I want to make sure you understand what I'm really saying here. Your bank account is a tool, not a destination. It is where you keep transaction money, emergency funds, short-term savings for specific near-term purposes. It is not where you build wealth. Wealth building happens through ownership of productive assets, primarily businesses and real estate, that compound over long periods of time at rates exceeding inflation. The process is simple, almost boring. You take every dollar you don't need for immediate consumption or emergency reserves, and you invest it in quality assets within your circle of competence. You ignore the daily noise, the market fluctuations, the scary headlines. You just keep accumulating ownership, keep letting it compound, keep reinvesting the dividends and rents, keep giving time and mathematics room to work. Do that for 20, 30, 40 years, and you will be wealthy. Not might be. Will be. The math is inexorable if you don't interrupt it. The alternative is to keep your money in the bank. Watch the nominal numbers stay stable. Feel safe and slowly, invisibly, inevitably become poorer as inflation compounds against you year after year after year. Then one day you wake up at 70 or 80 and you realize you've spent your whole life being careful and you ended up poor anyway. That is the fate I'm trying to help you avoid because I've seen it happen too many times to too many good people who thought they were doing the right thing. You know what Warren says, and I agree with him completely on this. Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. If you buy businesses you don't understand at prices you can't justify, yes, that is risky. If you use leverage you can't handle, That is risky. If you panic and sell during crashes, that is risky. But if you buy quality businesses at fair prices within your circle of competence and hold them patiently through market cycles, that is not risky. That is about as close to certain wealth creation as exists in this world. Meanwhile, holding cash feels safe but is actually the riskiest thing you can do over the long term because you're guaranteed to lose purchasing power. The safe feeling is an illusion. It is your brain confusing lack of volatility with lack of risk. They're not the same thing. Cash doesn't volatilize on your account statement, but it absolutely volatilizes in real purchasing power. You just don't see it happening because nobody marks your cash to market every day in real terms. I'm 99 years old. I don't have many years left, but I've been thinking about what I want people to understand after I'm gone. And this is high on the list. Don't let your fear of market volatility drive you to do something that is guaranteed to make you poor. Don't confuse stability of account balance with stability of wealth. Don't keep your money in banks earning nothing while inflation steals from you every single day. Move that money into productive assets you understand. Give compounding time to work, and have the discipline to never interrupt the process. If you do that, if you really internalize what I'm telling you and act on it consistently, you won't need to worry about running out of money in retirement. You won't need to burden your kids. You won't need to keep working when your body gives out. You'll have more than enough because you'll have let mathematics work for you instead of against you. And that is all I really want for people. Not to get rich, though some will, but to have enough. To be secure, to not spend your final years worrying about money when you should be enjoying what time you have left. So please, take this seriously. Look at how much cash you're holding. Ask yourself honestly, do I really need all of this sitting in the bank? And then have the courage to move what you don't need into productive assets that will actually compound your wealth over time. Start today if you can. Not tomorrow, not next week when you've done more research. Today, because every day you wait is a day of compounding. You can never get back. Time is the most valuable input to compound growth, and you're spending it right now whether you're investing or not. Make it count.